Do you ever wonder why we are drawn to villains? How we end up rooting for the bad guys in movies? How we like to play them in video games? Well, today we're going to find out. Welcome to the context and the glamorization of villains. Have you ever noticed that how some of the most iconic figures in pop cultures are actually villains? Be it the Joker, the Punisher, Batman is kind of sketchy. And more recently, Thanos.
I am inevitable.
So why are we fascinated with criminals and villains anyway? Let's find out.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
And it's not just movies and cinema. In video games, some of the most popular franchises, such as GTA, put you in the role of the villain. You basically have to steal cars, rob banks, and you have the option of murdering half the city. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe this is going to be one of those moral panic talks like Jack Thompson and his crusade against video games in the 2000s, where he took it to the Senate trying to take down the video game industry, claiming that they were making kids violent. I was a kid during that time and I did some stupid influenced by video games, but I've turned out to be a sort of well-adjusted adult. But this goes even deeper. There was a woman in the UK in the 60s and the 70s called Mary Whitehouse who had a whole crusade against television. And man, she had some strong quotes. In December 1974, she wrote of the deliberate propagation of the idea that there is no proof of the effects of television on standards and behavior. To reject its effect and its ability to declaim or pervert truth is to deny the potency of communication itself. It is crazily to question the ability of education to affect the social conscience and to train the human mind. So that is to say, all of this is nothing new. Ever since we had electronic media and probably print media at cartoons, we've been freaking the f*** out on what effect it has on society, leading to moral decay. So we're not here to talk about that. So moral panics aside, what makes villains popular? It's easy to see that some of this is related to power fantasies. Most of us are pretty powerless in our everyday lives, and just watching someone, even if it's a villain, laying complete wreckage and displaying awesome power seems fun. And you can see the same dynamic play out time and time again in video games, especially in multiplayer. It's always fun to crush your friends, even if you don't know them.
I'm dead, dude. I'm dead, dude. Yeah, it's nothing.
But it also runs deeper than that. Psychologically speaking, Sigmund Freud had some thoughts on the matter. According to Freud, wish fulfillment is tied to human nature, which is, in his view, inherently antisocial, biologically driven by the undisciplined eats pleasure principle to get what we want when we want it. And villains do that exactly. The only thing holding back the id is society. Even if the psyche fully develops its ego, source of self-control, and superego, conscience, Freudians say that the id still dwells underneath, and it wishes for many selfish things, so it would love to be a supervillain. The second psychological factor in play is that we would rather be villains than victims. Psychologically, anger activates us and feels better than anxiety or fear. One who feels victimized and cannot figure out constructive ways to stand up, be strong, or become heroic might twist the need for self-assertion into destruction. Alternatively, a healthy person simply might focus on how all characters assess themselves in any given story, even if it's a villain. But there's more at play here. We would rather be villains than victims. Anger activates us, and it feels better than anxiety or fear. In fact, in the 80s, during the economic downturn, there was a major shift in entertainment media, and that's when anti-heroes became real popular. Of course, the easiest way to make an anti-hero appear sympathetic and make you root for him is if they're fighting an even bigger asshole than they are. This is the plot of almost every Guy Ritchie movie and the entire point of Suicide Squad.
Hunka hunka!
And fun fact, Apple doesn't allow companies to use their products in entertainment if it's used by a villain. That seeps out into the real world as well. We can see that the rationalization of criminals, what they tell themselves when they commit their crimes, when they rob a bank, for example, they also latch on to this kind of dynamic and say that they're fighting an even worse enemy than they are, try to gain the public sympathy, and so on and so on. But it rarely holds up in court. And as fun as villains may be, rooting for the villains comes at a hidden cost that we might not understand, and it's called blaming the victims. So let's dive into that part. Why does victim blaming happen, and why does it seem so omnipresent? Now that's tied to a different psychological phenomenon that's intimately connected to the ones that we just talked about. It's called the just world phenomenon. Psychologist Melvin Lerner observed the just world phenomenon, a common tendency to assume victims must deserve to be victims rather than believe that bad things can happen to good people. The worse the tragedy is, the worse we tend to think the victim must be. So when Hannibal Lecter mutilates and eats not only a person who offended him, but also his victim's spouse, human nature motivates us to think the worst of that relative as well. In other words, the cruelty is the point. And outside of entertainment media, we can feel that there's like a broader talk of victimization and talking of people as victims of some sort of injustice. The problem with that, it seems, that it doesn't really connect with any real human being outside of a small media bubble. And if you've been listening so far, you can get the point why. The reason it doesn't connect is because nobody really wants to be a victim. They would rather be a villain. So if you talk of people as if they were victims, what you're essentially saying is that they have zero power. And that makes them really angry.
Oh, Muppets on Facebook thinking you're bad, mate. I'll line every last one of your birds up.
In fact, if someone falls for a scam, they are less likely to report it to the police because they are ashamed for being so stupid, which is reinforced by the public perception that if you fall for a crime, you must have deserved it, either because you're a bad person or because you're dumb. But the problem with that is that lies and scams can get so sophisticated that no matter how smart you are, you can be had. So the wider problem of victim blaming leads to a situation where we have criminals running around because nobody dares speak up. And as long as a scammer remains uncaught, they can continue robbing other people.
The footage clearly shows a man riding a hoverboard into a shop in Mitcham in South London and then casually riding out again without paying for the contents in his hands.
The less people report a crime or stand up to criminals, the less awareness there is, which makes it easier for the culprit to pull off the same scheme again and again and again. It also doesn't help that culturally we seem to have the memory of a goldfish, so we continue to fall for crimes that are old as the book. Another possible takeaway, however, if you've been following us closely, is if you see that something bad is happening, don't just claim to be the victim. You can be the bad guy who takes down the even worse bad guy. So where does that leave us? One could make the argument that portraying villains and anti-heroes as sympathetic characters is problematic, because it leads to copycat behavior that leads to moral decay. And in fact, that was much of the argument of moral panics of old. But these days, they do seem to ring an uncomfortable bell. They seem a bit more true than when they did back in those days. Was society wrong and the critics right? Should we just start making shows that only show positive characters and positive role models? Should all television be NCIS and other forms of propaganda, which actually do drive down crime by making the police seem like an omnipotent force? We would argue that that's not the case. Rooting for the villain is something that's deeply rooted in human psychology. Unfortunately, we can't change it at the snap of a finger like Thanos can end half of the world. The problem seems to be that, if you recall what Freud said, is that we have our animalistic id with its own selfish needs. But it's counteracted once we develop our egos and superegos.
I am the one who knocks.
There were always people, especially children and teenagers, who are easily impressionable and influenceable. Young people are more prone to copy stuff that they see on the screens. As they grow up, it's natural for them to imitate their role models. The problem seems to be that something has changed in society. Because in the normal course of development, when a person grows up, they're interacting with society and their peers and other people. It grounds them into reality. It counteracts the effects of the media. But it seems that lately we have decided that instead of a functioning real-life society, what we're going to do is interact solely through digital mediums. And it's seriously f***ing with our moral compass. The problem is not the positive portrayal of villains and anti-heroes. There's only going to be more of those as we enter a recession. What you want to watch out for is social contagion. Thank you very much for watching The Context. I was your host, Gergő Varga, and I hope to see you soon.